Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to discuss levels of organization in biology and in the human body. In the previous video we discussed compartmentalization in the body. Here we are going to talk more about how the body is actually put together, starting with the smallest and least complex components and then building up to the entire human body itself. As you can see here, we can look at the organization of the body through two different lenses, although those two lenses are basically two sides of the same coin. Number one, we can consider the hierarchical organization of materials in the body, things like atoms and molecules and cells and tissues and things of that nature. And then we can also consider the organization of the organ systems themselves once we get there. And that's going to be an important launching point for us this semester because the back half of this semester is going to involve us actually discussing the specific functions of those organs and organ systems and how they work to maintain homeostasis. So you've probably seen figures like this when you took general biology, but the way we're going to tackle this is we are going to start at the organismal level, which for our purposes is the most complex. We're not going to get into ecological levels like the biosphere, the community, and populations and things of that nature. So the organism that we're talking about in this class is obviously a human and the human body. So the human body, as we're going to see here as the most complex level of organization, the human body is made of different organ systems. The figure you're looking at here illustrates the urinary system, although we will very quickly go through all the different organ systems here in just a minute. And the different organ systems themselves are, of course, made up of individual organs. If you look at the illustration of the urinary system, you can not only see the bladder, which is illustrated here, but you can also see the kidneys as well. So as it pertains to the organ systems, it's going to be advisable, I think, for you to become somewhat familiar as you possibly can now, with the different organ systems in terms of what organs are in them, what their general functions are, because it's going to be really important that you have a good handle on that in the future, because like I said, the back half of this semester is really going to involve us functioning on the specific functions of those organs and the cells and molecular processes within. So just to kind of quickly go through these, just for general function purposes, the integumentary system obviously involves things like the hair and the skin. This actually aids in the compartmentalization that we talked about before. It separates materials in the body from materials outside the body. And then as it pertains to the skin also functions to aid in cell-to-cell communication because embedded within the skin are sensory receptors and sensory neurons that direct messages from the skin pertaining to things like touch and temperature towards control centers in the body. The musculoskeletal system, of course, we're familiar, involves the use of muscle contraction to move the skeleton around, and this, of course, is how we move our bodies, how we walk, and maintain our physical activities. But in relation to the first video that we discussed, muscle contraction actually expends a lot of energy, and this involves a radiation of heat, and this actually contributes greatly to body temperature homeostasis. The shivering that occurs when your body temperature gets too low actually is the forced and involuntary contraction of these skeletal muscles, and that radiates heat and generates the heat that raises the body temperature. As for the nervous and endocrine systems, we are going to have almost entire units devoted to these, but for now, they both facilitate cell-to-cell communication in homeostasis loops for a wide variety of different bodily functions. And we discussed in the very first video, of course, that both of these systems involve long-distance communication in the body. For the nervous system, of course, the messages travel long distances via nerves, and in the endocrine system, this involves hormonal messages traveling through the bloodstream. For the cardiovascular system, here, we're going to see a couple of different things. Number one, the heart itself, which is made of cardiac muscle, acts as a major effector for loops involving blood pressure and oxygen levels. So the brain has a great deal of control over how hard the heart is working, and how hard the heart is working is a major player and a major function of your blood pressure and how much oxygen and how many nutrients cells in the body are getting. So the heart can be controlled in that way to make sure that these levels of nutrients and oxygen are always appropriate. And then furthermore, the actual radius of blood vessels in the body, usually we're talking about arteries and arterioles in that regard, the radius of these blood vessels can be regulated to divert blood flow and regulate blood pressure. You can kind of think of pipes opening and closing in that regard. Blood vessels are very much the same way. The lymphatic system, which we're not going to talk about a whole lot this semester, lymph vessels, which carry another kind of extracellular fluid, they regulate the volume of the interstitial fluid by returning excess interstitial fluid back to the veins and back to the blood plasma. We'll see more of this later in the semester when we study cases of edema, which is sometimes more commonly known as swelling. That is just an excess amount of interstitial fluid in the tissues, and that's why things swell up, because there's too much fluid there. The lymphatic system helps to drain that fluid away and return it to the bloodstream. The respiratory system actually involves a collaboration with the musculoskeletal system because muscles surrounding the thoracic cavity actually contract and relax in order to physically draw air in and out of the lungs. Once oxygen-rich air is in the lungs, then that air is going to move into the bloodstream, in which case oxygen and carbon dioxide moves in and out in order to make sure, number one, that oxygen is delivered to cells in the body that needs them, and excess carbon dioxide waste is removed from the body. The digestive system involves a myriad of enzymes that digest complex food molecules in the food that we eat into more simple components that can then be absorbed by the digestive system and the digestive tract into the blood, and then these small energy-rich compounds can be delivered to cells all throughout the body so that they can use it to make energy for their everyday functions. The urinary system, which we looked at before, filters blood to remove excess water, salts, and other waste into a liquid product called urine, which is then expelled through the bladder and through the urethra. The idea here is that once the blood is filtered, any blood that exits out of the kidneys should then have ideal composition, with the urine then containing all of the stuff that we did not want in the blood to begin with. And then finally, the reproductive system, not only does it participate in the actions of the endocrine system, because there are some hormone-secreting tissues here, like the testes and the ovaries, but the reproductive system also houses the germ cells that will produce gametes, that being sperm and egg, for the sake of sexual reproduction. So moving beyond the organ systems, if we get back to our levels of organization, the organs, of course, being the more complex on this side of the bracket here, the organs are made of different types of tissue, of which there are 4 different varieties, and we will have videos dedicated to each of the 4 types. And then the tissues are made of individual cells. In this illustration, we can look at the urinary bladder here. One of the major players in the contraction of the bladder that allows us to urinate is a type of smooth muscle called the detrusor muscle. This smooth muscle tissue, of course, is made of many, many, many different types of individual smooth muscle fibers, which are all working together to pressurize the urine contained within the bladder so that we can expel it out when we urinate. Cells, of course, are made of individual molecules, which are then, of course, made of individual atoms, even though there should be an arrow there. I'm not sure why that disappeared on us. Molecules are made of individual atoms, and atoms, of course, are the least complex type of material in the body. The word atom means cannot be cut. Atoms cannot, by any means that we know of, be forced into simpler units that can operate independently of one another. So molecules are just atoms that are chemically bound together, and that is something that you will see a lot of in Chapter 2, even if we don't have specific videos outlining them. Things involving molecular bonding, ionic bonding, covalent bonding, and things of that nature. So that pretty much covers the levels of organization, but just real quick before we wrap things up, let's look at a kind of long illustration here to make sure that we get the point. Atoms, which come in different elemental varieties like carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus, they form the basis for how we build molecules in the body. It turns out that the 6 elements that you see here, those so-called Schnapp's elements, C-H-O-N-P-S, these 6 elements make up approximately 95% of all living matter. So living tissue, living matter tends to contain a lot of these 6 atoms here. We, of course, use these atoms to build all the different molecules that are important for life, both the inorganic and the organic molecules. An example of an inorganic molecule here is, of course, water, which is 1 oxygen bound to 2 hydrogens, and then an organic molecule here, like this amino acid, but both of them, you can see, are built by attaching atoms together by chemical bonds. The difference between an inorganic and an organic molecule is that the organic molecule contains both carbon and hydrogen. Water here is considered inorganic because it does not contain carbon as well. Molecules themselves can be polymerized together to form much bigger and much more complex molecules called macromolecules, things like lipids and proteins and nucleic acids and carbohydrates, which are all polymers that are built by joining smaller molecules together by dehydration synthesis. We will, of course, have separate videos on that later on, so don't worry about them too much for now. Macromolecules assemble together to build subcellular structures called organelles. Mitochondria, of course, are membrane-bound organelles for which cellular respiration takes place, the major way by which our cells make energy, or the nucleus, which is where the DNA-based chromosomes are stored. That's where we store our genetic information, of course. So these organelles are actually made of lipid and protein and carbohydrate, and then obviously the nucleus contains the nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. So these organelles, again, are built out of big assemblages of these macromolecules that you see here. The organelles, of course, come together to build individual cells, and there are many dozens of different types of cells in the body: your brain cells, your muscle cells, your liver cells, your heart cells. So you can see a couple of different examples here, like a neuron in the nervous system, a myocyte in the muscular system, an erythrocyte in the blood. So these are all different cells that are built in very much the same way, but as the semester progresses, you're going to see that there are specific structural and functional differences from cell to cell that makes them good at what they are meant to do. Neurons are good at doing things that muscle cells are not good at doing, and vice versa. One good example of this is that this erythrocyte, or red blood cell here, actually does not have a nucleus or any mitochondria. It is basically just a big floating bag of hemoglobin. Cells, of course, come together to build our 4 different types of tissue, which are nervous tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. These are basically just big groups of different types of cells that all serve some sort of common purpose or help to share some sort of common function, again, all for the sake of maintaining homeostasis. Tissues come together to build individual organs like the bladder or the kidneys, which we talked about before. And generally speaking, organs tend to contain at least 2 different kinds of tissues. In the case of the bladder, you're containing both muscle tissue and epithelial tissue, in addition to some nervous tissue as well. And then finally, organs come together to build functional organ systems that again work together to maintain homeostasis. So that's going to pretty much do it for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms I think you ought to be familiar with after this video. And then for checking your understanding, number 1, name a few examples of each level of organization in the body. Number 2, name 2 to 3 organs in each organ system. And number 3, why would something like the skin need to contain all 4 of the different types of tissue? Alright, that's going to do it for this video. If you have a question, leave it in the comments section and I will give you an answer. Alright, so long.